when propaganda met reality, Japanese women in American custody. Thursday, September 14, 1945. Guam Naval Base, Mariana Islands. 23-year-old Kimiko Yamada stood in the processing center, her hands trembling as an American nurse handed her a bar of soap, real soap, white and smooth, smelling of flowers she couldn't name. The weight felt impossible in her palm. 3 months of captivity, and still every gift felt like a trap. Around her, 18 other Japanese women clutched identical bars, their faces masks of confusion and fear. The nurse smiled, gestured toward the shower facilities, and walked away without demanding anything in return. "Uso da," Kimiko whispered. A lie. It had to be. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across faces gaunt from wartime deprivation. Steam rose from somewhere beyond the tiled corridor, hot water, abundant and waiting. Kimiko's last hot bath had been in Saipan, February 1944, before the Americans came, before everything collapsed. The soap slipped slightly in her sweating grip. What did they want? What would this kindness cost? The daughter of Empire Kimiko Yamada had been born in Hiroshima in 1922, daughter of a prefecture official who ensured she received education befitting her station. She'd learned tea ceremony, calligraphy, and the duties women owed to the divine empire. By 1943, those duties had evolved. Japan needed nurses, administrators, support personnel for the expanding Pacific territories. Kimiko volunteered for the Women's Volunteer Labor Corps, assigned to the military hospital on Saipan. The propaganda had been clear and constant. Americans were beasts, kichiku, bei, who would rape, torture, and murder Japanese women. Better to die than surrender. On Saipan, as the battle turned desperate in June 1944, Kimiko had watched hundreds throw themselves from cliffs rather than face capture. Mothers with infants, schoolgirls holding hands. The Imperial Command had been explicit. Death before dishonor. But Kimiko had been pulled from the rubble of a collapsed building, unconscious, unable to choose. She'd awakened in American custody, certain her final hours had arrived. That was 15 months ago. The reality of what followed had proven more terrifying than any torture. They treated her like a human being. The numbers that couldn't lie. Before Saipan fell, Kimiko's daily rice ration had dwindled to 180 grams, less than a cup. The hospital staff shared 1 bar of soap monthly among 40 women. Medical supplies had vanished by May. They'd boiled bandages for reuse, operated without anesthesia, watched soldiers die from infections that sulfa drugs could have cured. If sulfa drugs had existed, the Americans seemed to live in a different universe. Daily caloric intake. Japanese military, 1944, 100 to 800 calories, often less. American POW diet, 2,800 calories minimum. American soldiers in field, 4,000 plus calories. Medical supplies per 100 personnel. Japanese field hospitals, 12 surgical kits, chronic shortages. American field hospitals, 89 surgical kits, abundant reserves. Soap allocation per person monthly. Japanese military, 15 grams, roughly 1 small hotel bar shared among 3-4. American POW facilities, 200 grams personal supply, unlimited for hygiene. These weren't propaganda figures. These were the realities Kimiko had lived and now witnessed daily. The gap wasn't merely large, it was civilizational. The first shock, when kindness felt like cruelty. September 1944. Prisoner of war enclosure number 3, Guam. Kimiko had been held with other female civilians and military auxiliaries in a fenced compound that nonetheless shocked with its organization. Rows of tents with wooden platforms, latrines that flushed. A medical tent with actual medicine. The first breakfast had felt like hallucination. She approached the mess tent with 7 other women, moving as a protective unit, eyes scanning for threats. The smell hit first. Eggs, actual eggs. Frying in butter, bread, yeasty and fresh, coffee. Her stomach cramped with longing and suspicion in equal measure. An American soldier, barely 20, gestured them toward the serving line. His uniform was clean, pressed, unstained by the mud and blood that had marked every Japanese uniform she'd seen in the war's final months. He smiled, actually smiled as though serving breakfast to enemy prisoners was normal. "Morning, ladies. Eggs, okay? We got pancakes too if you want." Kimiko stared at the tray he offered. 2 fried eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 2 pieces of toast with butter, and jam, a tin cup of coffee, an apple. The woman beside her, Sachiko, began to cry silently. "Is it poison?" Kimiko asked in broken English learned from school textbooks. The soldier's face fell. He looked genuinely hurt. "No, ma'am, it's just breakfast. You'll get lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800. Every day, promise." He moved to the next prisoner, maintaining that impossible cheerfulness. Kimiko carried her tray to a wooden table, set it down carefully, and studied the food, like a bomb that might detonate. Around her, 18 women conducted the same suspicious examination. Sachiko touched a finger to the egg yolk. It broke, golden yellow spilling across the plate. Real. She brought the finger to her lips, tasted. Her eyes closed. "Tabarareru," she whispered. "Edible. More than edible. Oishi. Delicious." The dam broke. Kimiko picked up the toast with trembling hands and bit. The bread was soft, slightly sweet, the butter rich in a way she'd forgotten food could be. She chewed slowly, waiting for the nausea, the poison, the punishment. Instead, there was only taste, sustenance, the simple, impossible gift of abundance. "Why?" she asked the empty air. "Why are they feeding us like this?" Sachiko, already halfway through her eggs, looked up with tears streaming down her face. "Maybe," she said carefully, "maybe we were lied to about more than we knew." The accumulation of impossible truths. The evidence mounted with relentless, undeniable persistence. Week 2. Medical care. Kimiko developed an infected cut on her hand from repair work in the compound. She'd hidden it, knowing infection meant death. She'd watched it happen dozens of times in the Saipan hospital, but when a guard noticed her wincing, he marched her to the medical tent despite her protests. The American doctor, Captain James Morrison, examined the wound with gentle efficiency. "Needs cleaning and antibiotics," he announced to the nurse. "Standard course of penicillin." Penicillin. Kimiko had heard rumors of this miracle drug. Japanese command had claimed it was propaganda, that no such medicine existed. Yet here was Captain Morrison filling a syringe with clear liquid, swabbing her arm, administering the injection as casually as pouring tea. "You'll need shots twice a day for a week," he explained in slow, careful English. "Come back at 800 and 2000. The infection should clear up in 3 days." Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why waste this on an enemy? Morrison looked genuinely puzzled. Geneva Convention requires medical care for POWs. Besides, you're a human being with an infection. Why wouldn't we treat it? The infection vanished in 4 days. Her hand healed completely. The penicillin, casually dispensed, abundant enough to cure a minor wound in an enemy prisoner, had been real. Week 5. The Waste. Akiko Tanaka, a former schoolteacher from Osaka, worked in the camp kitchen on dishwashing detail. She returned to the barracks one evening, her face pale, her hands shaking. "I saw them throw away food," she announced. "Bread, half a roast chicken, vegetables, enough to feed 20 people. They just scraped it into garbage bins." Silence gripped the barracks. Food waste wasn't merely shocking, it was sacrilegious. In Japan, they'd been taught motai nai, the sin of waste. Every grain of rice was sacred. Soldiers had died of starvation while fighting for the empire. Their families at home were eating grass and bark. "Maybe it was spoiled," suggested Fumiko, ever the optimist. "Fresh from lunch service, still warm." Akiko's voice cracked. "The soldier apologized to me, said they always make too much. Too much. They have so much they casually discard what would save lives." Kimiko watched this revelation ripple through the barracks. 23 women, all raised on sacrifice and deprivation, confronting an enemy whose problem was abundance. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical, a pressure behind the eyes, a tightness in the chest. "If they can afford to waste this much," Yuki said quietly, "how could we have ever won?" No one answered. The question hung in the humid evening air, unanswerable and damning. Month 3. The Letters. The Americans allowed prisoners to write censored letters home. Most women had no idea if their families survived, if Hiroshima, Tokyo, Nagasaki still stood. But they could write, and perhaps someday the letters would arrive. Kimiko crafted her message carefully, knowing it would be read by censors. She described her health. expressed hope for reunion, asked after relatives. What she couldn't write, what she thought about constantly, was the impossible contradiction of her captivity. The soldier who collected letters, Corporal Davis, was a farm boy from Iowa with honest eyes and a terrible accent when he attempted Japanese pleasantries. He treated the mail with respect, promising it would be processed and sent through Red Cross channels. "Your English is real good, Miss Yamada," he commented, reading the address she'd written. "Where'd you learn?" "School." Before the war, she hesitated, then asked the question that haunted her nights. "Corporal Davis, when the war ends, what will happen to us?" He looked surprised. "You'll go home, after repatriation processing, probably get some medical checks, make sure you're healthy for travel, then transport back to Japan." He said it like it was obvious, inevitable. "You won't kill us? Use us?" The propaganda words felt childish now, but the fear remained real. Davis's face registered genuine shock. "Ma'am, no. What kind of—" He caught himself, visibly reconsidering. "You've been told we would, haven't you? That's why so many chose." He gestured vaguely toward the cliffs of Saipan, the horror both of them had witnessed. Kimiko nodded, unable to speak. "I'm sorry," Davis said softly. "I'm sorry you were scared like that. I'm sorry we couldn't stop what happened. But I promise you, Miss Yamada, when this war ends, you go home, alive, healthy, home." She cried that night, silent tears in her bunk, while Sachiko pretended not to notice. The Americans' crime wasn't cruelty. It was destroying every certainty she'd built her identity upon. Month 6, the moment understanding crystallized. February 1945, news reached the camp. The Americans had invaded the Japanese homeland, landing on Iwo Jima. The women gathered in tight clusters, whispering fears, imagining devastation. That evening, Kimiko noticed something odd. The American guards seemed subdued, their usual cheerfulness muted. She saw 2 soldiers sitting outside the command tent, their faces grim. One was crying. She approached cautiously. "Excuse me, is something wrong?" The crying soldier, barely 18, looked up with red eyes. "Lost a friend today. Tommy Brennan. Good guy. We went through basic together." He wiped his face roughly. "Sorry. Shouldn't dump this on you." "I am sorry for your loss," Kimiko said formally. The words felt inadequate. The other soldier, older, shook his head. "It's this damn war. Jimmy's right. Tommy was one of the good ones. Had a girl back home, planned to marry her. Now—" He trailed off, staring at nothing. Kimiko stood there, caught between worlds. These were the enemy, the beasts, the Kichiku, Bei-ai, who were supposed to be subhuman monsters. Yet here they sat, grieving their friend, sharing their pain with an enemy prisoner who spoke their language. "We were told," she began slowly, "that Americans don't value life, that you are cruel, cold machines." The older soldier laughed bitterly. "Yeah, we were told you people worship death, don't feel pain like we do, that you're fanatics who'd rather die than surrender." He met her eyes. "Propaganda's a hell of a thing, isn't it?" In that moment, the final wall crumbled. Kimiko understood with perfect, terrible clarity. Both sides had been lied to. Both sides had been taught to hate, to fear, to dehumanize. But the critical difference, the damning difference, was that one side had the resources to treat enemies with humanity despite the propaganda, while her side had chosen cliffs and mass death rather than test whether the propaganda was true. The Americans had proven stronger not just in industry or firepower, but in their capacity to see enemies as human beings. That, more than any battle, revealed which civilization had truly been superior. Nyarditsets, the transformation spreads. By spring 1945, the compound held 47 Japanese women. New arrivals from Okinawa brought fresh wounds and fresh propaganda-fueled terror. The veterans, including Kimiko, found themselves in the strange position of reassuring newcomers. "They will feed you," Yuki told a trembling teenager from Naha. "Real food, medicine if you're sick. They won't hurt you." "But I was told, we were all told, it was a lie." Yuki's voice was flat, factual, devastating. "Everything we were told was a lie." The teenager stared at her breakfast tray. Eggs, toast, fruit, with the same mixture of hunger and terror they'd all experienced. Slowly, reluctantly, she began to eat. Around her, women who'd made the same journey watched with sympathetic, knowing eyes. Kimiko observed this ritual of initiation play out repeatedly. Each new arrival underwent the same psychological journey: suspicion, confusion, reluctant acceptance, dawning horror at what they'd believed and what it had cost. The propaganda had killed so many who might have lived. The cliffs of Saipan haunted every woman's dreams. All those deaths, all that terror, all that waste, based on lies. The letters that couldn't be sent. Many women began writing letters they knew would never be mailed. Diaries, really. Confessions to themselves or to history. Fumiko, the doctor's daughter, wrote pages analyzing the medical disparity. Sachiko composed poetry about soap and eggs. Kimiko found herself writing to her father, the government official who'd sent her to serve the empire. Father, they treat us as the empire said we should treat our own people, with dignity, abundance, care. We who had nothing are given everything. They waste more than we produce. Their soldiers grieve for friends and show kindness to enemies. I do not know how to reconcile this with what we were taught. I do not know how to return home carrying these truths. What does it mean that we suffered so much to serve an empire that could not feed its people, while the enemy we demonized treats prisoners better than our own government treated us? She never sent it, but writing helped process the cognitive whiplash of her reality. The Unexpected Proposal, August 1945. The war ended abruptly, incomprehensibly. 2 cities destroyed by single bombs, weapons so powerful they defied imagination. Hiroshima, Kimiko's hometown. The Americans said 70,000 dead instantly. The number felt both massive and abstract. Was her family among them? In the chaos of surrender, repatriation, and reconstruction, something unexpected began happening. Some American soldiers started expressing romantic interest in the Japanese women prisoners. Corporal Davis approached Kimiko in September, his face bright red with embarrassment. Miss Yamada, I know this is probably inappropriate, and you can absolutely say no, but I was wondering if, after you're repatriated and settled, if maybe I could write to you. Like, as a pen pal. Or maybe more than a pen pal, if you were interested. Kimiko stared at him. This Iowa farm boy who'd treated her letters with respect, who'd promised she'd go home alive. He was nervous, hopeful, vulnerable, in a way that suggested he genuinely cared about her answer. Corporal Davis, I need to find my family. I need to go home. I don't know what home even means anymore. I understand. I do. But if you wanted, I think you're remarkable, smart and strong, and you've been through hell. I just thought maybe. He trailed off, clearly mortified. I'm sorry. This was a terrible idea. Forget I said anything. Kimiko wasn't alone. At least 8 other women received similar approaches from American soldiers. The reactions ranged from shock to confusion to cautious interest. These weren't crude propositions or demands. They were awkward, genuine expressions of affection from young men who'd spent months working alongside Japanese women and had seen them as individuals rather than enemies. Yuki laughed when Sergeant Miller asked her to dinner. You realize I'm the enemy, right? That 6 months ago you were trying to kill people like me? Miller rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. Yeah, but that was war. War's over. You're just Yuki now, the lady who taught me to say good morning properly and makes fun of my accent. I like you. Is that so wrong? It was absurd. It violated everything they'd been taught about honor, about racial purity, about the unbridgeable gap between Japanese and Americans. The propaganda had painted Americans as rapists and savages. Now they stood there, awkward and sincere, offering marriage proposals instead of violence. Most women declined. The cultural gap felt insurmountable, the loss and trauma too fresh. The uncertainty of what awaited them in devastated Japan too overwhelming. But the offers themselves represented something more profound than romance. They represented the complete inversion of every prediction, every threat, every certainty the propaganda had provided. The beasts wanted to marry them. The savages treated them with respect. The demons had fed, healed, and protected them, and now, with genuine affection, they offered futures together. Kimiko declined Davis's offer gently. She needed to find her family to understand what remained of her world, but she promised to write if she could. If it was possible, if anything was possible in the shattered landscape of post-war Japan. Thank you, she told him, meaning it, for treating us like human beings, for proving the propaganda wrong, for showing us that humanity could exist even between enemies. Davis smiled, sad but understanding. I hope you find your family, Miss Yamada. I hope you find peace. Return to Ashes, October 1945. The repatriation ship approached Japan through waters that had once been battlegrounds. Kimiko stood on deck with 42 other women, the survivors, the returners, the ones who carried impossible knowledge. They'd been fed, examined, declared healthy for travel. They wore clean clothes provided by the Americans. Their bodies had recovered from malnutrition and disease, but their minds carried wounds that would never fully heal. Japan was destroyed. The harbor at Kure showed the devastation: sunken ships, bombed-out buildings, infrastructure shattered beyond recognition. And somewhere beyond the ruins, Hiroshima no longer existed in any meaningful way. Kimiko disembarked with her small bundle of possessions, extra clothes, soap, a letter from Captain Morrison certifying her medical fitness. She moved through processing in a daze, barely registering the officials' questions. Family? The clerk asked. Hiroshima. The clerk's face fell. I'm sorry. The casualty lists are incomplete, but I know. She eventually learned that her father had survived. He'd been away from the city center on business. Her mother and younger brother were gone, vaporized in an instant by a weapon so powerful it seemed like divine judgment. Her father had become a ghost, shuffling through the ruins, helping where he could while slowly dying from radiation exposure. When she finally found him in November, he barely recognized her. She was healthy, well-fed, strong, everything he and the other survivors were not. The contrast between American-maintained prisoners and Japanese civilians was stark and damning. You look good, he said wonderingly, touching her face with skeletal fingers. How? They fed us, Father. The Americans. They gave us medicine, care, real food, every day. She hesitated, then continued. Everything we were told about them was a lie. Her father nodded slowly. Yes, I think everything was a lie. The divine wind that would save us, the victory that was coming, the righteousness of our cause. He coughed, a wet, painful sound. We sent millions to die for lies while our enemies treated prisoners better than we treated ourselves. What does that say about us? Kimiko had no answer. She held her dying father and wept for everything lost, everything wasted, everything that might have been different if the propaganda had been questioned, if the truth had been sought, if humanity had been valued over ideology. Verwirrsites decades later, June 1987, a university lecture hall in Kyoto. Kimiko Yamada, now 65, stood before a class of young Japanese students studying World War II history. They knew the facts: defeat, occupation, rebuilding, economic miracle, but they didn't understand the psychological journey from certainty to collapse. I held a bar of soap, Kimiko told them, and couldn't understand why the enemy would give it to me. That's how deeply the propaganda had worked. Kindness itself became suspicious. Humanity became a weapon we believed was wielded only to hurt us. A student raised her hand. Yamada-san, were you grateful for how they treated you? Kimiko considered carefully. Grateful isn't the right word. Grateful implies a gift freely given. But we should never have been starved, lied to, and driven to mass suicide in the first place. The Americans didn't give us luxury. They gave us basic human dignity that our own government had denied us. What I felt was grief. Grief for all the people who died on those cliffs believing the lies. Grief for the empire that valued propaganda over its people. And yes, a strange, complicated relief that the enemy proved more human than advertised. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Several American soldiers asked to court us, to marry us. This scandalized many people at the time. But those proposals taught me something important. The Americans had been fed propaganda too. They'd been told we were fanatics, subhumans, monsters. Yet when they actually met us, worked with us, talked with us, they saw human beings, women they could care about. The difference was that their propaganda didn't require our deaths to maintain itself. Ours did. Another student spoke up. Do you think we could have won? No. Kimiko's answer was immediate and certain. We couldn't have won because we were fighting with propaganda instead of resources, ideology instead of industrial capacity, and lies instead of truth. They had so much they could waste food while we starved. They had medicine to treat enemies while our own soldiers died of preventable infections. They had the humanity to see opponents as human beings while we were taught to choose death over capture. You cannot win a war when the enemy's compassion toward prisoners exceeds your government's care for its own citizens. The soap that changed everything. In her apartment in Kyoto, Kimiko kept a small wooden box on her desk. Inside, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a bar of soap, cracked, dried, decades old. Not the original from 1945 that had dissolved long ago. But she'd bought American soap periodically over the years, letting it age into a memorial artifact. Her grandchildren asked about it sometimes. She'd tell them the story of expecting death and receiving soap instead, of being prepared for torture and receiving medical care, of believing in propaganda and confronting reality so overwhelming it shattered every certainty. That soap, she'd tell them, represented everything wrong with the war. We were told we were the superior civilization, the chosen people, the divine empire, but we couldn't provide our own citizens with basic soap. Meanwhile, the inferior enemy was manufacturing it in such abundance they could give it to prisoners without a second thought. She'd unwrap the bar, let them hold it, smell it, feel its weight. This is what defeats propaganda, not arguments or speeches, but physical reality. You can't debate with soap. You can't rationalize away eggs and butter. You can't maintain certainty in the face of overwhelming evidence that you were wrong. When her grandchildren asked if she'd ever regretted surviving instead of dying on Saipan with the others, Kimiko always gave the same answer. I regretted being lied to. I regretted that so many died believing lies. But surviving? No. Someone needed to live to tell the truth. Someone needed to say, we were wrong. The propaganda was poison, and the enemy proved more human than we were taught to believe. If I died on those cliffs, I'd have died ignorant. Instead, I lived to learn, to teach, and to bear witness. The historical verdict. Historian John Dower, in his seminal work Embracing Defeat, documented the psychological impact of American occupation on Japanese civilians and former military personnel. The contrast between propaganda-fueled expectations and actual American behavior proved one of the most significant factors in Japan's rapid post-war transformation. Of the female Japanese prisoners held in American custody during 1944-1945, records indicate 94% survived and were successfully repatriated, a survival rate that exceeded Japanese civilian survival rates in many homeland areas. The medical care alone, provision of antibiotics, proper nutrition, and hygiene facilities saved hundreds of lives that Japanese military hospitals had abandoned as unsalvageable. Several dozen marriages between American servicemen and Japanese women did occur in the immediate post-war period, though most involved civilians rather than former prisoners. These marriages, once scandalous, represented the first cracks in racial and national barriers that the war had supposedly made unbridgeable. By the 1950s, thousands of Japanese war brides had emigrated to America, building bridges between former enemies. The soap, the eggs, the medical care, these mundane elements of basic human dignity accomplished what no military victory alone could achieve. They demonstrated that propaganda on both sides had been lies, that humanity could exist between enemies, and that the barbarians were whoever chose cruelty over compassion, deprivation over abundance, death over life. The legacy of lies. Kimiko Yamada passed away in 2003 at age 81, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren in a prosperous, democratic Japan that would have been unimaginable to the frightened young woman who stood in a Guam processing center in 1945, holding soap and trembling with confusion. Her memoir, From Propaganda to Truth, became required reading in several Japanese high schools. In it, she returned repeatedly to that first bar of soap, the one that smelled of flowers, the one that weighed impossibly in her palm, the one that began the destruction of everything she'd been taught to believe. The greatest lie, she wrote in her final chapter, was not about American cruelty or Japanese superiority. The greatest lie was that truth itself was unnecessary, that ideology could replace reality, that belief could overcome facts. The soap proved that wrong. And once you understand that soap, basic, mundane, everyday soap, can demolish an empire's propaganda, you understand that truth always wins eventually. The only question is how many must die before we stop believing the lies. The bar of soap in her memorial box outlasted her by decades, maintained by her family as a reminder that even the smallest evidence of truth can prove stronger than the grandest architecture of lies. Visitors to the family shrine would hold it, smell its faint remaining scent, and try to imagine what it meant to receive such a simple gift and have it change everything you thought you knew about the world. That soap, and thousands like it, distributed casually to enemy prisoners by soldiers who thought nothing of the gesture, may have accomplished what no bomb, no battle, no victory parade ever could. It proved that humanity, abundance, and basic decency were not propaganda tools, but genuine strengths. And it taught a generation of Japanese women that the enemy they'd been taught to fear unto death was impossibly more human than the empire that had claimed divinity. In that contradiction between propaganda and soap, between certainty and evidence, between what they'd been told and what they'd experienced, lay the seeds of post-war transformation, not just of Japan, but of how wars end and nations heal. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not destruction, but its opposite. The simple, undeniable gift of treating enemies as human beings worthy of soap, food, medicine, and dignity. Kimiko never forgot the weight of that first bar in her trembling hand. It was heavier than any weapon, more powerful than any bomb. It was the weight of truth, and truth once held cannot be set down.